Thomas and Friends is an amazing show with many amazing seasons. But one season that just doesn't get enough attention that it deserves, in my opinion, is Season 10. A lot of people would say it was a bad season, but I strongly disagree because it has an awful lot of episodes that I truly love and only a few duds. Today, I'm going to be ranking all the episodes from this season, and afterwards explain why this season rocks. I've already made an analysis on an episode from this season, which I called the most underrated Thomas episode of all time. So that straight away proves my point that this season is underrated. But let's see how the other episodes function. Without further ado, let's get ranking. Man, that just sounds so weird. Follow That Flower is not a good start to the season in all honesty. The story is quite dumb, and I can't say I like Thomas here. His dynamic with James is enjoyable though, so this episode goes in the average tier. A Smooth Ride is an improvement. They brought Sir Handel back, with a reason for his absence and a new personality. His reason for his absence is a little half-baked though, as it says that he worked in the stone quarry all summer, when literally every episode in the last 5 seasons takes place in any season other than summer. But I'm glad they even bothered. Every other returnee is just put in the picture and we're supposed to pretend that their absence never happened. Not this time though. I also prefer his new persona to his old one, as it helps make Duncan more bearable. Sure, the 3 strikes formula is used, but it isn't too degrading, and the strikes do feel a little bit different from one another, and the scenes with Mr. Percival and the coach are quite funny. This episode goes in the good tier. Thomas in a Jet Plane is a solid episode. Jeremy is a nothing character, but the story is quite interesting, and it's nice to see an engine and plane rivalry story. I place this episode in the good tier, but below A Smooth Ride. Percy and the Funfair is a nothing episode. There isn't much of a plot and it's quite gimmicky. The only thing that prevents me from putting this in the bad tier is the fact that the Chinese dragon returns, so this goes in the poor tier. The green controller is dumb but ironically funny. The idea of a railway engine being in charge is nonsensical, but hey, when has the show ever made sense? Percy is quite stupid, but not to the point where he's unbearable like in other episodes. I definitely prefer Dowager Hat's Busy Day over this, but I still like this episode, and I place it in the good tier. Duncan Drops a Clanger is a fun episode. The title is hilarious. Skarloey and Rheneas are for once perfectly in character. The town square set looks amazing, and for once, this episode doesn't use the 3 strikes formula. No, I don't count Duncan passing Rusty, Skarloey, and Mighty Mac as 3 strikes, and Duncan himself feels pretty much in character. He's still careless, but unlike the classic series, it would seem Duncan actually learned his lesson this time, as we never see him going too fast ever again. My only gripe with this episode is how Duncan's crew are completely ignored in this episode. Surely they would have slowed him down, but that's to be expected at this point, and it doesn't bother me personally. Thomas's Tricky Tree is a really boring episode. Thomas is kinda dumb here, but not as dumb as in other episodes. The narrow gauge engines do feel somewhat in character, but the episode itself is quite dull and goes in the poor tier. So far, Season 10 isn't doing very well, but don't worry, I promise it gets better. Toby's Afternoon Off is an episode that I kinda like. I don't think Toby was necessarily the right character for this type of story. I feel like this kind of story would work better for someone like Rosie, but I still like this episode for the time progression. This is an episode where you really feel the movement of time, the hours sliding past, and I think the 3 strikes formula for once help influence it. I also find the ending with Toby helping Henry to be incredibly interesting, and I think Toby being in love with the animals at Farmer McColl's farm is very fitting. I place this one in the good tier. It's Good to Be Gordon is one of the very few fan-favorite episodes this season, and I too really like it. I'm gonna keep my review short so as to not sound like a broken record that's about to fall apart. Gordon's characterized perfectly, Henry's special Cole retcon isn't a big issue, the tender swap is really cool, and I'm of the theory that this episode takes place between Cole and the Flying Kipper. This episode goes into the favorites tier. Seeing the Sights is the worst episode of Season 10. The story is incredibly boring. Annie and Clarabelle not saying anything to Thomas is so dumb. Thomas himself is incredibly stupid here, and the resolution is so underwhelming. This episode goes straight into the bad tier. The fact that we're only 10 episodes in and we only now got a bad episode really says a lot about the quality of this season. Many people treat season 10 as if it only had bad episodes. Well, that clearly is not the case. Fearless Freddy is another really strong episode. Freddy is my favorite character introduced this season. While his backstory is kinda confusing, I do really like his character. An old and wise engine who isn't perfect. Most old characters in this show have no flaws, and when they do, they are either written as children or completely out of character. Freddy, on the other hand, not only has flaws, but he has them immediately. The moral here is also a really good one, and I think this episode is one that both kids and adults can relate to. My only gripe with this episode is Skarloey and Rheneas. Swap them out with 2 younger engines and they're a perfect episode. This episode goes into the favorites tier. Toby's New Shed is one of Toby's better episodes post season 7, and his best episode in the hit era. Toby for once feels close to his classic persona, and Thomas for once is quite tolerable. Both trying to help someone they think is struggling is quite sweet, and Thomas's idea for a birdhouse is quite cute. A very sweet episode and goes in the favorites tier. Edward Strikes Out is a pretty meh episode. The thing about Rocky not having an engine is pretty dumb and the crash is quite nonsensical, but Rocky is not a bad character and the scene of him lifting Gordon is pretty fun to watch. I place this episode in the okay tier. Topped Off Thomas is a really unfortunate episode. It showed promise at the beginning with the first 3 minutes, but the rest of the episode lets it down. Spencer and Thomas's dynamic is really good, but the story has so many questions that I'm not going to ask. This episode goes above Seeing the Sights in the bad tier. Which Way Now is the only episode of the show that I've done a whole video dedicated towards, and I love everything about it. I love how Rusty is characterized, I love how the 3 strikes formula is used, I love the episode's morals and the pacing, and I love Season 10. This episode goes above It's Good to Be Gordon in the favorites tier. Thomas and the Shooting Star is a really nice episode. The visuals alone look really nice, and Clarabelle with a tail lamp is a really nice detail. I also like Thomas's ideas for wishes, and the ending, while a bit cheesy, is still really sweet. The plot does feel similar to Thomas and the Rainbow, but in my opinion, much better. This episode goes in the good tier. Big Strong Henry is the other Gordon and Henry episode this season. Their dynamic is handled really well, and Thomas and Percy helping Henry out shows how far they've come since season 1. To be honest, I don't have much to say besides that, and I place this episode in the good tier. Sticky Toffee Thomas is a pretty dumb episode, but I actually kinda like this one. Sure, this episode does use the 3 strikes, but I personally don't mind it. The crashes are pretty entertaining, and Thomas's costumes did look pretty nice. Overall, this episode is pretty stupid, but not to the point where I'm bored and wondering when the next episode plays, unlike a certain episode that I will get to in a minute. Wharf and Peace is another out-of-character Skarloey episode that I personally find to be alright. I do find Skarloey's fear in this episode to be quite relatable. However, Skarloey was the wrong character for this type of story, and it would work so much better with a newer character. Or maybe this episode takes place during Skarloey's younger years when the wharf first opened. Either way, this episode goes below Edward Strikes Out in the okay tier. Thomas's Frosty Friend is a very, very stupid episode. Thomas has 0 brain cells, the snowman is creepy as all hell, and the 3 strikes formula completely drag out the story, and it thus feels boring. This episode goes into the bad tier, above Seeing the Sights. After that episode, however, the season improves dramatically. Every episode past this point ranges from somewhat passable to amazing. Emily and the Special Coaches is the first of this bunch, and it's one of the best of the entire show. Emily and Diesel's dynamic is amazing, and this is the first time we get to see Diesel in a more sympathetic light. I don't have much else to say, as I think the Yellow Striker said it best. This episode goes into the favorites tier. Thomas and the Colors is another Thomas and James story. While I'm not into football, I do really like their dynamic here. While kind of forgettable, their dynamic is fun throughout. I do think Reds vs. Blues did the concept far better, but this one isn't bad either. I think I said that already. Thomas and the Birthday Mail is fine. I was never a big fan of Rosie as a kid, and I dislike her even more now. Her design overall is absolutely terrible. She looks nothing like her bases, and I really hate that lavender livery. I prefer the red coat they gave her in Season 21. I also find some of her faces to be nightmare fuel, especially in Season 12 with those CGI faces, and I also don't like the fact that she has makeup. Even character-wise, she's not very interesting. She's basically Thomas's stalker, and that's it. Again, she got so much better in CGI. As far as the episode itself goes, it's boring and has a mixed message on stalking. Rosie basically follows Thomas wherever he goes and gets no repercussions for her actions. I'm totally on Thomas's side throughout this episode. I do find the visuals in this to be good though. This episode overall goes into the okay tier. Duncan's Bluff is the best episode of Season 10. Yes, I know it's the Thomas and X favorite episode too, but for good reason. Duncan and James make such a great dynamic, basically following up the events of Rock and Roll, and the fact that we don't really see them again together afterwards makes this episode all the more wholesome. Their dynamic is fun, and Duncan himself feels like he's grown from his Season 4 betrayal. He still makes mistakes, but when his faults get someone else in trouble, he'll own up and make it right. In Season 4, I doubt he would do this. He would probably just snigger as James gets told off. This episode goes at the top of the favorites tier. Missing Cars is honestly just as good. Renese's character is a big improvement from the previous season, and also adds some depth to how he acts in the established canon. He does the right thing, but he doesn't come off the consequences of his good deed. That's a mistake even a wise engine would make. My only gripe with this episode is Skarloey. I would have preferred it if he was tired because of his old age, not because he was overworked. But other than that, this episode goes below Duncan's Bluff. Thomas and the Treasure is a gimmicky episode, but a very solid one. The model work in this episode is quite nice, and the clues to the treasure really make the kids think, which I like. I just wish that Thomas wasn't the main character, and instead a newer character took his place. This episode goes in the great tier otherwise. James the Second Best is an episode that has recently been getting some love, and for good reasons. James and Edward are really strong in this episode, the crash is quite creative, the scene at Knapford Station where the engines discuss Edward's true character is quite wholesome, and the episode is a nice contrast to the typical Edward and James stories. I actually have this episode tied with It's Good to Be Gordon in the ranking department, but I'm placing it below for now. Thomas and Skarloey's Big Day Out, our final episode, is pretty solid. While I would have preferred it if either Duck or Oliver had Thomas's role as they both work on the coastline, I still like this episode. I really like the episode's concept, and engine taking Skarloey around Sodor is a very strong one, and I find Skarloey to be close enough to his original character, especially at the end. This episode goes in the great. Overall, I can safely say that this season is very underrated. Every episode except for 3 is at least decent, and this season was very character driven. Almost half of the episodes this season focused a lot on character dynamics. Here's only some examples: Thomas and James, Edward and James, Henry and Gordon, Thomas and Gordon, Emily and Diesel, James and Duncan, etc. A few of the characters this season have actually improved since last season. Again, here's some examples: Henry, Toby, Rheneas, Rusty. The narrow gauge entrance got a ton of focus this season. James got 4 leads, Gordon got 3 leads, Henry and Toby got 2 leads, and Edward and Percy had at least 2. Another thing I really like about Season 10 are its morals, and how they are handled. Most of the episodes aren't the typical sharing is caring or don't rush your load type of stories. There are some that are actually quite interesting. Which Way Now has 2 moral, one that was obvious and another that's not so much. Check out my essay video on this episode for more information. Missing Trucks has a very interesting moral about how even doing the right thing has consequences. Emily and the Special Coaches is a rather interesting two-flawed protagonist type of story, where Diesel rightfully wants to get recognition, but goes about it the wrong way, and Emily wants to get the coaches back, but is wrongfully rude to Diesel as a result. There are many more examples of great morals. So overall, Season 10 is a great season, and I even go as far as to say it's my 4th favorite season of the show. This season goes above Season 7 in the favorites tier. And that concludes Season 10. Next month I'll be reviewing Season 11, and oh boy, I have a lot to say about that season. so stay tuned. Now, I better get running, because after this video, I bet most of you want me dead. So until next time, goodbye!